we've been on hiatus from the actual Gender Wars report for a couple of months. There's been all kinds of stuff going on in the world. Melanie's been putting up some really important and interesting content about what's going on in the UK on our channel. It doesn't quite fit with the Gender Wars report, but it does fit with some free speech issues that we talk about. There's a real disconnect between, what the policymakers and the government is thinking and believing and acting on versus what the people are actually experiencing, and that's kind of a theme that we see in gender issues quite a lot. I'm back from holidays. I did my first part of my cross-country trip this last 6 weeks. I drove out to the West Coast from Ottawa with a Jeep pulling a trailer, and then drove back. And then in a couple of weeks, I'm heading for Fredericton, and who knows, maybe parts beyond if I've got some time. And it's good to be back. Some channel updates, Melanie. What's going on with the channel?
What's going on with the channel? Well, I have commandeered it for a completely other purpose, like you said. I've been, obviously, I have my own personal reasons for being obsessed with what's going on in the UK right now. But you're correct, I think. I did think it was important because there are free speech issues that are extremely similar to what I've seen or what we've experienced personally here in Canada, the way that the media misrepresents what's going on, does not try to understand what the so-called other side is up to, what they're thinking. And that's the main reason I wanted to start talking about it, because it seems to me the situation in the UK is like Canada, but accelerated in terms of the way that the government is seeming to want to address it. So I have another video lined up that I'm going to work on over the coming days, where essentially I'm just going to read an article written 10 years ago, juxtaposed maybe with some imagery of what's been happening recently. But I think free speech is going to become a really important thing for people to talk about over the coming months, years. Well, I hope it will anyway, because I feel like we will be losing substantial amounts of freedoms if we don't start actually advocating for the importance of free speech. I think it's time for me to step back from the UK a little bit and focus on gender in Canada. So here we are.
Well, there's lots coming up. Today we're going to, we say this a lot, we're going to aim for a shorter episode. We have quite a substantial list of things that we're going to talk about. We're actually going to record that in 2 segments. This episode, this conversation, we're going to talk about a new document that's dropped from an organization in British Columbia called Lawyers Against Transphobia. It's basically a political lawfare manual. And while I was on my travels since the 3rd week of June, I've been meeting with lots of people across the country. I got wind that this document was being prepared, and I got some background on it, which I thought was very interesting, intelligence. And then we're going to talk a bit about the Olympics and what's been going on. Now, that's a global story with the Olympic boxing and developmental disorders, but there's a little bit of a Canadian tie-in and comment that we're going to bring together. And then we're going to finish this piece with what's happened with Jordan Peterson and the Supreme Court's decision to not hear his appeal. But before we jump into that, make sure you like and subscribe. Actually, we want to thank you for subscribing and following our channel and the work that we're doing. And we love your comments and feedback, as always. We reached 1,000 subscribers in the last month or so. That's a milestone for YouTubers. It's like we made the first baby step into being real podcasters. Get 1,000 followers. YouTube adds some support to that. They also give us a little bit of a boost in the algorithm, from what I've been told. Now, we have a good, strong number of watch hours. We've got a loyal, regular group who watches us regularly and gives us, as I said, great feedback. And we kind of get a sense of the demographic, people who are Gen X and baby boomers who are wondering what's going on with this gender thing. We try and keep the language as simple as possible. There's a lot of people who are really, really deep into the gender, women's rights issues in Canada and the health issues with respect to transition and the sports issues and things like that. And we try and give a high view, simple language, and do that in a really grounded way. And Melanie brings an academic perspective, and helps keep us grounded. And I try and sensationalize the headlines a bit and have some fun with the news. So why don't we jump into it? Melanie, you and I both came to this story independently.
Yes.
Tell us a bit about the Lawyers for Transphobia document.
Okay, let's bring it up. Okay, so I came across this actually from a post on Twitter, but you had mentioned it to me as well in a previous conversation. This document is, as we said, Lawyers Against Transphobia. The document is called Expelling Transphobia, a handbook of strategies to address transphobic attacks in the BC school system. I have spent a little bit of time looking at this document. It's not too long. It's 38 pages. So it's, if you're interested in finding something to read and look at, if you're new to some of these gender issues, this one's not too difficult to go through and it's pretty easy to read. But what is it? The authors of this particular document, I didn't know any of them except for Barbara Findley. Now, Barbara Findley, lowercase, Barbara, lowercase Findley, is a lawyer who's a prominent lawyer in, I guess, the LGBTQ plus IA movement. She seems to pop up all over the place. In Alberta, when the new regulations were put in place with the limitations on transing young people, Barbara Findley was involved in sort of like emergency mobilization against this transphobic attacks at the Simon Fraser University in British Columbia. She popped up there. She was also part of Amy Hamm's case. Amy Hamm having put up a billboard saying, I love J.K. Rowling.
I love J.K. Rowling, yeah.
Yeah. And that's been a really big issue. Amy Hamm's is a nurse who expresses that trans women are men, and there are real medical reasons for that. She's also a prominent person in the women's rights movement around this. So Barbara Findley shows up a lot, and Barbara Findley shows up in this document. But what is the document? The document...
Just before you jump there, Melanie,
yeah,
I want to point out the sensational language that they're using. And you used some of the sensational language already. But this document, if you look at the table of contents, I mean, chapter 1 is called a 5-alarm fire.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Barbara Findley jumping in an emergency response for transphobic attacks in Alberta, right? This is the histrionic language over the top that they use to make everything into a life or death emergency.
Oh, yeah. Well, this document is absolutely that. So it sets the scene about the 5-alarm fire. Like there is I'm going to exaggerate a little bit here, but it's like these kids are all killing themselves. There's a genocide going on for the trans people, and it's all happening in schools. And I'm going to use a UK turn of phrase here. These right-wing thugs are going into these schools and they're attacking all of these people. Now, we know that's not really the case. What's been going on from my perspective is that some parents have found out that there's material and topics which are inappropriate for certain age groups and have been going to their school boards, talking to teachers and not being heard, and that has sort of escalated. But what is transphobic violence according to the lawyers in this document? It says here, recent transphobic actions against schools and school boards have included picketing schools, disrupting school board meetings, harassing and doxing trans and queer teachers, harassing school trustees, protesting outside school board offices, coordinating efforts to elect trustees with a transphobic agenda, and alleging that teachers and trustees are indoctrinating children and allowing material in schools under the SOGI curriculum. So I feel like there's a framing here that is not entirely consistent with the reality of what some parents have been bringing forward. But we know that. So this is trying to give you the impression that these people are unreasonable individuals that are just hateful in their hearts, and they're extremists, and they don't want to engage with anyone, and they're attacking. That's sort of the framing that has been put forward here by this group. Now, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time going through it because I think it's important. If you're interested in these things, you should go read it for yourself. The rest of this document essentially outlines different tactics that can be used to counter all of these so-called transphobic attacks. And these are lawyers using things like human rights legislation, or at least quoting legislation, or where cases have been won, to silence the voices of people who have dissenting opinions or a different opinion to their own. That's what this document really is. That's how I've come to understand it. This document is a document that supports the silencing of anyone who may have a concern about anything to do with trans in school. Now, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the document. Maybe you've had a little look over it, Shannon, but did you have any, I don't know what you thought of it.
Well, one of the things that jumps out, obviously, that you've already said, Melanie, is the coordinating efforts to elect trustees with an agenda, otherwise known as democracy, right?
Yes.
Like here, to say that people organizing politically is problematic somehow, it's a little scary, but that's the way they work. And this is some of their handbook. Now I have, as I said, I had some background on this, and I mean, they do things like give specific direction or advice to school trustees to limit speaking time. So what we've seen in the last year with school boards cutting down on the amount of time for delegation, forcing anyone who wants to make a delegation to submit their presentation in advance so the school board can decide or not, which is basically a government censorship apparatus to limit speech. Right. I presented, or I delegated to the Ottawa School Board in March a year ago, and that was the gist of my presentation. You know, freedom of expression in Canada exists, and freedom of speech in the U.S. exists for us to be able to criticize the government. And if the government tries to limit our speech, then that's the fundamental violation. It sets up totalitarianism, where the people can't speak and criticize the way that against the way the government is doing things. And as we saw in a court case that came up over the summer or late in the spring, was that school boards are in fact a branch of the government. These groups can't censor people, yet we see this. I'm sure the lawyers know they're walking a fine line between canceling people's speech and their rights to speak. But this sets up some, it's just frightening how they think that.
Yeah, well, it wouldn't get anywhere if the legal system wasn't already on the side of this sort of action, because down in the document, it does quote Carolyn Bourjowski's case. Carolyn Bourjowski is a teacher that spoke out against some of the sexualized content of the books in school, and the trustees essentially cut her off from speaking entirely, quoting human rights legislation, and that is quoted in this document too, encouraging people to, as soon as you hear something transphobic, now we know transphobic is anything that goes against queer theory and gender ideology theory, I guess, that it's encouraging people to literally cut off their mics and not allow them to speak. It encourages people to basically march them out as soon as they hear something transphobic. So gender ideology, queer theory, these are contested ideas. They're not fact, but the legal system does, at the minute, support that sort of action under. Yeah. Correct. So it wouldn't happen unless that was supported, but we'll see what happens with that. It would be, if anybody's looking for a new project or something to look into, to spend some time on, I think this document would be a really useful thing to spend some time on and really go through with a fine-tooth comb. Look at the authors, look at the backgrounds, look at the information in this document. I would highly encourage that.
I did that really briefly this afternoon because I clicked on one of their links in the five-alarm fire section about suicide and suicidal ideation. Now the algorithms on YouTube don't really like people talking about self-termination. And it's the usual histrionics. Okay, it's an interesting study. It's done by Canadian Medical Association Journal. It was published June the 6th, 2 years ago. Then I went to, just to get a baseline or reference point, I went to the statistics on from Statista on successful and tragic, of course, youth suicide. And the numbers that we have, factually speaking, something between 8 and 10 per 100,000 people 15 to 19 years old every year. So it's about 1 in 10,000. And of course, it's tragic. And there are different cohorts of kids with mental health issues that are more vulnerable and susceptible to these than others. And there are also, significant mental health conditions. types of mental illness that make people more susceptible. As far as we know, the trans-identified group and the gay and lesbian kids who do have a higher, unfortunately, a higher rate of suicide than the rest of the population aren't any different from other significantly at-risk populations, diagnosed mood disorders or people with self-harming issues or eating disorders or that sort of thing. Those clusters of mental health issues all have a high rate or higher rate than the general population of suicide. They're people more susceptible. The other thing that often gets conflated is that there's a big difference between ideation, thinking about and ruminating about taking one's life, versus actually doing it. It's almost not comparable. Yes, there are risk factors that connect the two, but as usual, the trans activists, talk about suicidal ideation as if it's an epidemic, as if it's hysterical, as if it's a 5-alarm fire. Well, it's tragic. We do want to prevent it. Of course, we want to make sure that environments are set up to support kids with mental health issues and those kinds of thoughts and feelings. But to use that as the basis for manipulating the public, manipulating policy, establishing and justifying a set of lawfare tactics against parents and people who are criticizing the school system is
manipulative.
It's manipulative, yeah. And it's unfortunately all of this is systemic bullying. Right? We don't like your views, and so we're going to train everybody to shut you up, make your life more difficult, to devalue you, dehumanize you, and delegitimize you with tactical lawfare. I don't have much else to say about that. If anyone's interested in doing that bit of deep dive on this document, contact me. We can have an offline conversation. I might have some other resources that I can share with you, given the right conditions.
On the theme of free speech, I want to take us to the Olympics. So I came across this post just a little while before we started recording. This is Richard Dawkins, world famous biologist, wrote The Selfish Gene, then became a world famous person speaking about atheism. So he's been quite controversial for quite some time. He has had opinions that people may have tried to cancel for a long time, but this is what gets him canceled. What is it? His tweet says, "My entire Facebook account has been deleted, seemingly no reason given, because I tweeted that genetically male boxers, such as Imani Khalif, XY Undisputed, should not fight women in the Olympics. Of course, my opinion is open to civilized argument, but outright censorship. Out of all the controversy that this man engaged himself in, this is what gets him fully removed from Facebook. Well, who is Imani Khalif?" Okay, so here we have Imani Khalif. This is the very controversial boxer who's been fighting on the women's team at the Olympics. Now, some people say Imani is a male, some people say, or a man, some people say Imani is a female, but what we know is that Imani has probably a disorder of sexual development. That is it.
It's what we used to call hermaphrodism. It's essentially a birth defect. It's very rare, and there's many different configurations of this. Regardless, from what I understand, regardless of the birth defect and how it manifests itself, we either have a case of a biological female or a biological male. We have XX chromosomes, we have XY chromosomes, and the external sex organs and identification is ambiguous and difficult because of the birth defect.
What I just want to finish on for this story is the Canadian angle to it. So what has come out of this situation is that boxers and sports people, this has become a sign of resistance really for getting males out of female sports, whether it's with the fingers or whether it's these Canadian athletes here supporting females in female sport. Here we have more athletes supporting females in female sport. So even if the genetically male individual was allowed to play in female sports, what we have seen, which has been a bit of a win, is it's risen the profile of this kind of the harms that this sort of thing can do. Basically, people with male genetics beating up on people with female genetics in sport. And now we have this sort of resistance movement. What are your thoughts on this, Shannon?
Well, there's a bunch of things. So the gold medal match ended up being between the two boxers that have the same genetic disorder.
The two XY.
They were both tested, and the Imani Khalif didn't, or either withdrew or didn't contest the findings that said you can't compete. Now, this is sticky. Okay, like it's more, even more complicated than the normal trans-identified person in sports. It's more complicated because this is a person who legitimately has lived their life as a female, and they were born with this condition. It wasn't until puberty that they started. I think there's some sort of internal development of testes that releases testosterone, and they go through a male puberty more or less, besides instead of a female puberty. Now, people have better language than that than I do. Where this blew up originally for me was J.K. Rowling, big billionaire influencer, talking about this. And J.K. Rowling is a women's rights campaigner in the UK and has been fighting against male incursions into female spaces and including sports for years. And this initially became about turfy attacks on this boxer, and it's not the right comparison. I believe there has to be more nuance than that, and so it got into this big row, and actually looked like, I think that the trans activists legitimately scored some points in this in the early days of this exchange, as there was a lot of incomplete information, a lot of speculation about the nature of this person's condition, and why exactly they were competing. Now, let me read you from Aaron Kimberly. Aaron is a friend of mine, Gender Dysphoria Alliance Canada. He was a founder, he was a podcaster with Aaron Terrell on the GD Alliance podcast for a couple of years, and he's now moved on to Bigger Influence. After recently shaving his beard, that's actually huge news in Gender Critical Canada that Aaron has shaved the beard. It isn't necessary to call those with 5 alpha R2D and raised as girls men in order to exclude them from female sports due to biological advantage. Now, I believe, and Aaron, forgive me if I'm wrong here, that part of Aaron's transition was due to ambiguity, a DSD. And Aaron's a nurse and has really good language around what these conditions are. Because it's been important for him to know and understand. So he says, no need to call these girls men. It is important to protect women. It isn't important to fuck with people's self-perception due to a medical condition. It's not the same as trans identity politics. These queer politics are hurting people with DSDs. She can't compete against women due to biological advantage of her medical condition. Is an acceptable position to take. I maintain my view that, and he cites an academic, Stoller's understanding of gender identity development is useful in the development of a fair and safe policy. So he says it's not necessary to, be mean to this person and say you're a man, or they live as a woman. They have a birth defect. Why go that road when one could simply say that with the very unusual chromosomal and hormonal profile in an XY person, then it's not fair to compete. And boxing isn't the only one, although it's the most impactful.
It makes it
dangerous.
Very obvious. Yeah, it made it very obvious why this can be a problem, for sure.
Yeah, because other athletes with DSD conditions have won track events and cycling events and things like that. So this is an important conversation about fairness in sports. It shouldn't be about turfs and TRAs. The IOC has embarrassed themselves as far as I believe anyway, and set back The Olympics to me, and I love the Olympics. My wife and I watch the Summer Olympics, especially because it happened to be the summer that we met. These are early dating weeks, and we were spending time together, and the Olympics were on, and we both love sports, and we that's important to us. And I think it goes against the values of competition on the international stage to have the IOC defending this kind of unfairness and this kind of dangerous unfairness to women. We're going to talk a little bit about Jordan Peterson and the Supreme Court decision, or lack of decision. As viewers know, I mean, you can't avoid J.K. Rowling. You can't avoid Elon Musk in terms of their influence. And really, we can't avoid Jordan Peterson. Everyone, I think, knows who he is, a former professor of psychology at the University of Toronto. I've been a fan and follower of Jordan Peterson since about 2005. I used to track the best lecturer, university lecturer competitions, and he was a winner of those. He was a Harvard prof. He had the Timothy Leary Chair of Psychology at Harvard. To me, you can't get much cooler than that as a Timothy Leary fan. In 2016, he was blown into the national and international spotlight when he spoke out against Bill C-16, which we call the pronoun bill, or the gender identity bill, or it's a trans rights bill. What it was the inclusion of protected language and pronouns in the Canadian Human Rights Code. It established the fiction of gender identity in Canadian national law. Provinces had done it before. Our friend Barbara Finley, had helped to instantiate this through some what I call precedent scaffolding, or building up the legal structures in order to make these kinds of things defensible. I talked to someone who followed this process, and I can talk more about this precedent scaffolding maybe another time. Peterson said this is going to cause a problem. It sets the environment for compelled speech, where you must say things. And it took me a long time to understand that. It was so foreign to me. But what he said was, our law says that maybe you can't say things. Maybe there's things that are so bad and hateful that we just don't want people to say them. Maybe. There's a huge difference between things like hate speech laws, which are questionable because they limit free speech, and compelled speech laws where you must say certain things under penalty. Okay, when the government starts telling you what you must say, that's a giant leap from what you can't say. So that blew up, and this was 2016, and this was my first real, experience or seeing these trans activists mob him and damage equipment at the University of Toronto and harass him, chanting about trans rights. And Peterson has taken this, he chose to be outspoken about it, as we all know. And then after leaving University of Toronto, the people who weaponize, like we talked about Barbara Finley and this Lawyers Against Transphobia, who weaponize process in order to punish people, that's what happened to Jordan Peterson. So, tactically, this is happening, by the way, to Amy Ham again out in Vancouver, where people have done mass complaints to the BC College of Nurses and Midwives and have started a whole new set of legal proceedings against her to try and get her fired. So this is a way to control speech and a way to use lawfare and the abusive process. So complainants, anonymous ones, went to the Ontario College of Psychologists and made complaints about Peterson and his so-called transphobia. EGAL Canada, which is a publicly funded so-called non-profit advocacy group that has big corporate sponsorship dollars, acted as an intervener in some of these cases against Jordan Peterson, talking about how trans people are so victimized you can't say anything that would hurt their feelings. And he went through a series of appeals on the judgment from the CPO, the College of Psychologists of Ontario, that he had to take mandatory social media training for his speech as a private individual on social media and on podcasts, not as a psychologist. The big issue here for free speech is that can these weaponized bureaucracies control what you say outside of your professional activities? So no clients complained. There was not even some of these complainants came from outside the country. And I'm a licensed professional. There are many people who are licensed professionals, and can our governing bodies all of a sudden start to say what you can and can't say?
Yes.
Which is kind of frightening. This is what Bruce Party calls the administrative state. And as we go down this road, it's a troubling decision that the Supreme Court said not going to even hear the case. We're going to just let the college be responsible for itself, and we're not even going to hear it. I think we have to hope for legislative change. Pierre Poilievre commented on the decision, and we have to hope for legislative change that these elected bodies of professionals, essentially, that are supposed to be there to help enforce professional standards.
Yes. Now, Pierre Poilievre did mention it on Twitter. He said, another government bureaucracy threatens to ban a Canadian from practicing his profession because he expressed political opinions that the state does not like. Now they force him to undergo political re-education. Mm-hmm. Bring home free speech for Jordan Peterson and everyone else. Well, the interesting thing is Pierre Poilievre does actually have the capacity to bring about or bring home this free speech, as he says. And I would strongly urge Pierre Poilievre, if he is serious about bringing home free speech for Jordan Peterson and anyone else, to consider repealing Bills C4 and C16. I have not heard him speak on that at all, even though I've seen him start discussing some issues that we talk about here on this podcast. Here's another thing that he retweeted recently. This is an opinion piece that we were supposed to cover last week, but didn't. Another person that we know helped write this report on the transgender industry in Canada in the National Post. It's time Canadian medical leaders stood up to gender medicine. And this was retweeted by Pierre Poilievre, but again, does not mention Bill C4 and C16. Now, these are the core reasons why these things are going on in the country right now. So that would be my personal appeal to Pierre Poilievre. I will believe that you are serious if you seriously talk about repealing these two bills. I have seen Pierre Poilievre talk about repealing other bills, so left to be seen whether that will happen or not.
Indeed. That covers off, I think, the three topics that we wanted to cover off for this episode, Melanie. And we're going to drop another episode in a couple of days. Tomorrow is the 11th of August, which is another one of the big Pride parades. And the next episode that we're going to record is going to cover off all of the drama and frankly, the embarrassment that the Pride organizations should be feeling due to their political infighting and the collapse of their organizations because of that infighting. Thanks again for subscribing and liking and helping us grow our channel. It's great to be back, and as always, enjoy my conversation with Melanie talking about these issues in Canada. Well, let me go to this. There's a secret project. Well, it's not so secret, actually. We're talking about Wokileaks.
Oh, yeah, Wokileaks. Good thing to bring up at the end, yes.
Yeah, Wokileaks is a project of the Parents' Rights Coalition of Canada, and it's we've got some good, strong tech skills and people collaborating to create a portal through which...
Well, it's a WikiLeaks for wokeness.
Yeah, you can anonymize some information that you may have access to and get it to us, and there's a couple things we can do. We can find someone who's willing to do a deep dive on it. We can cover it on the weekly Gender Wars report. There are bloggers and analysts that are willing to take some of this information and move it towards publication. And there's a group called Blacklocks, and this is an Ottawa journalist who was with the Hill Times, and I can't remember her name. She set up this Blacklocks, which is a publishing organization, and invites tips for freedom of information, or what are called MFIPAs, Municipal Freedom of Information, Privacy, da-da-da-da-da. And we have people in our organization that love FOIAs, love freedom of information. Yeah,
very important tool.
Given,
we should all be FOIA-ing all the time.
Melanie's done some really great work on this. And so, sometimes it's not, here's the bag of data, but maybe you want to check out and get a freedom of information on this meeting that happened, or maybe you want to get a freedom of information on this decision that happened related to someone's employment, or so that we want to expose throughout this organization, well, our project here with the Gender Wars Report and the organizations that we're connected with, we want to expose the corruption and the strategic lawfare that these well-organized activists are using against us. And as we expose it, also develop some tactics so that we could actually organize politically. We can put candidates together to run for school trustee, engage in the democratic process, and then make it so that there's more open dialogue and communication.
Brilliant. Okay, well, this has been a great episode, and I guess we'll see you next time. Have a great weekend.